If you haven't been tracking how much video games have become ginormous, lumbering, conflicted projects over the years, it goes without saying that they don't always come together very smoothly. That's true enough for gameplay, but also plot, because when you've got literally hundreds of people working on story, character, gameplay, etc., it's no surprise that continuity and basic logic can slip through the cracks. While all these games are entertaining enough that these plot holes can be ignored, it doesn't mean that they haven't tormented committed fans ever since release. From plot invalidating inconsistencies that you can't not think about, to bizarre characterizations that make no sense, fans had to simply grit their teeth and try to forget, or at least ignore, such obvious lapses in storytelling. If you want to preserve your untarnished memories of some classic video game stories and moments, this is your last chance to turn back. I'm Scott from WhatCulture.com, and these are 10 stupidly obvious video game plot holes you just had to ignore. Also, spoilers for a whole bunch of games, check the description below for details. Number 10. Why wasn't Scott arrested for the mansion killing spree? Heavy Rain. Heavy Rain is, in fairness, a game with its fair share of eyebrow-raising narrative inconsistencies, what with one of the game's playable characters, private investigator Scott Shelby, turning out to be the origami killer himself in a continuity-derailing plot twist. But even accepting that Shelby is presented as an unreliable narrator, there's one bothersome scene near the end of the game that just beggars belief. Shelby heads to Charles Kramer's mansion and shoots several of Kramer's bodyguards dead, while the player is given the option of letting Kramer die of a heart attack or saving his life. Yet, even if the player saves Kramer, Shelby's violent slaughter is immediately disregarded, and despite Kramer's ability to point out Shelby to the police, he's never reported to the cops. If you get the ending where Shelby escapes scot-free, it seems even more absurd, especially in a game so intently focused on the consequences of every character's actions. Number 9. Aiden is retconned to be King Leoric's son. Diablo 3. The protagonist of the first two Diablo games is simply known as the Dark Wanderer, until Diablo 3 came along and forced a heap of contrived retconning upon a fanbase already displeased by the game's always online DRM and auction house shenanigans. Despite the first two games firmly establishing that King Leoric had just one son called Albrecht, Diablo 3 rejigs these facts to reveal that not only does Leoric have another second son, but this new child is none other than the series' original protagonist, the Dark Wanderer himself. In a further feat of unnecessary demystification, it turns out his real name is Aiden. Not only is Diablo 3's story almost totally unaffected by this reveal, therefore rendering it kinda pointless, but it actively forces the player to reconsider the series' established lore in pretty awkward ways. Namely, what the hell was Aiden doing when his dad went mad prior to the events of the first game? Given that not a single character recognizes the Dark Wanderer is Leoric's son in the first two games, it retroactively makes the original Diablo in particular seem totally ridiculous. Number 8. How did Claire and Leon enter the quarantined Raccoon City? Resident Evil 2. One of the most nagging plot holes in the Resident Evil franchise regards the ease with which Leon S. Kennedy and Claire Redfield are both able to enter Raccoon City in the second game. This is in spite of the fact that Resident Evil 3, which partially takes place roughly 24 hours before the second game, reveals that the city had been quarantined and blockaded to prevent people from leaving or entering by the military. After years of fan hand-wringing, Resident Evil 3 scenario writer Yasuhisa Kawamura rustled up his own excuse in 2012, claiming the heroes were able to slip through the blockade when the military retreated during a zombie attack. That is kinda a pretty lousy excuse, and while the plot hole hardly derails the franchise, it does signify a major logical contradiction between the second and third games. Number 7. How does Haytham know Connor is his son? Assassin's Creed 3. The twisty lore of the Assassin's Creed franchise has always been rather on the eccentric side, though the third game left fans especially bemused with its treatment of protagonist Connor and his father Haytham Kenway. One of the game's most memorable scenes occurs in Sequence 9, where father and son meet up in an old church, and curiously, Haytham seems to magically know that Connor is his son, despite this never being indicated beforehand. The game's Animus database even flat out states that Connor's mother Zio kept his existence a secret from Haytham, so when he shows up to the scene armed with this knowledge, it's incredibly jarring. There's no real excuse for this sort of thing, yet it's also not much of a secret that AC3's development was extremely troubled, and so it's pretty impressive that the end result mostly turned out as well as it did. Also, FYI, if you're a secret Assassin's Creed 3 fan, the remake from this year is actually pretty damn solid. Number 6. Snake didn't need to crawl through the microwave corridor. Metal Gear Solid 4 Guns of the Patriots. One of Metal Gear Solid 4's most iconic moments occurs in the game's climax, where old Snake drags himself through a microwave corridor in order to reach the GW server room. And while it's a tremendously powerful and overwhelmingly epic moment at the time, it doesn't really stand up to much narrative or logical scrutiny when you consider that the Metal Gear Mark III ends up doing almost all of the work to shut down GW in the end. Snake puts himself through a grueling experience while Mark III seems to deal with the microwaves just fine. We know that the Mark III can use terminals and operate machinery, so why did dear old Snake have to fry himself half to death? The argument from fans is that Snake needed to hold off the Scarabs from attacking the Mark III while it uploaded the worm to disrupt GW. But did we also forget that the Mark III has an electric whip? The Mark III is a copy of the Mark II after all, and we were shocking dudes left and right for hours beforehand. It's far more probable that Hideo Kojima concocted the incredible visual of this scene and then wrote the story around it, which is kinda his thing, but it rarely makes for a coherent, meaningful script. Number 5. Why didn't the clock tower accident alert anyone? Uncharted 4: A Thief's End. One of the more memorable set pieces in Naughty Dog's brilliant Uncharted 4: A Thief's End is Chapter 11's epic clock tower sequence, where Nate needs to climb to the top of the tower and ring a gigantic bell in order to proceed. This results in a predictable ton of property damage, ending with gigantic gears breaking apart and the bell itself crashing to the ground, only barely avoiding Nate himself. The scene makes it abundantly clear that this calamity was noisy as hell, and given that the exterior Madagascar streets were shown to be extremely busy just minutes beforehand, it's completely impossible to believe that nobody would investigate the building following such thunderous commotion. Instead, Nate and Sully are freely able to proceed through the building and complete a puzzle for the next 20 or so minutes without encountering a single other person. And if you want to take it any further, the insane volume of this whole thing should have made both men deaf for life. Number 4. How did a single necromorph slaughter the USM Valor? Dead Space. The original Dead Space is a masterpiece of claustrophobic tension, and one of its more distinctive moments sees protagonist Isaac Clarke learning that an incoming rescue vessel, the USM Valor, has picked up an escape pod containing another necromorph and become overrun. However, anyone who's played a Dead Space game will scarcely be able to believe that a single slasher-type necromorph would be able to run riot in a destroyer-class vessel, annihilating all 67 of its crew members. Even accepting the element of surprise that the necromorph may have had, it's highly implausible that a single slasher could dismantle everyone on board before they could destroy it. Especially as without an infector on board, there was no way to quickly spread the contagion throughout the rest of the ship. Fans have long debated how the Valor was able to fall so easily, but ultimately it's easier to just spare your sanity and your time and pawn it off as because video games. Number 3. Why didn't Cloud revive Aerith? Final Fantasy VII. Perhaps the most famous plot hole in video game history is one compounded by its sheer emotional impact. Aerith's unexpected death in Final Fantasy VII left players shook to the core, but once they wiped away the tears and took a few deep breaths, many began to question just why Cloud couldn't have used a Phoenix Down to bring her back. Now, even if you accept that Phoenix Downs are only able to rouse someone from unconsciousness rather than actual death, what about revive materia? That stuff is perfectly capable of cancelling death states, a fact that's curiously glossed over for the sake of some emotionally shattering drama. Granted, the Final Fantasy franchise's grasp on its own internal logic, especially as it pertains to magic and life or death, is loose at best. But even so, it's easy to understand why an urban legend persisted for so long that there was a way to bring Aerith back to life. Because to that end, why the hell was she shown looking up at the Highwind in the game's instructions? Just why? Number 2. Why didn't anyone catch tuberculosis from Arthur? Red Dead Redemption 2. Later on in Red Dead Redemption 2, steely protagonist Arthur Morgan learns that he's contracted tuberculosis and has a limited time left to live, eventually leading to his death at the end of the game. But what's baffling about this is that despite the highly contagious nature of tuberculosis, Arthur doesn't appear to infect anybody else, even while continuing to live, eat, drink, sleep, and use the bathroom at a very crowded camp. Given that TB killed 1.7 million people worldwide as of 2017, the notion that Arthur didn't spread his illness to his pals well over 100 years prior is kinda just crazy. It doesn't ruin such a masterful game, but it's a peculiar oversight in an otherwise detail-rich work of art. Even just a few brief glimpses of campers coughing and sputtering occasionally would have sewn this plot hole up nicely. And number 1, the Space Pirate Logs, Metroid Prime. The first Metroid Prime is just brilliant, but the original GameCube release shipped with a plot hole nagging enough that it was actually removed from subsequent releases. At the very end of the game, Samus finally encounters the titular monster, a gigantic spider-like creature equipped with mechanical weaponry, which in-game logs in the original NTSC release suggest were assimilated from the Space Pirates. Except this directly contradicts logs elsewhere in the game, which claim that the Space Pirates were unable to pass the impact crater's force field and reach Metroid Prime in the first place. If Samus is the first person to breach the crater, what the hell is going on? Thankfully, Retro Studios kinda fixed this issue for both the PAL release a few months later and 2009's Metroid Prime Trilogy re-release, wiping any mention of the final boss from the Space Pirates logs. However, that still doesn't explain where the Metroid Prime received its mechanical weaponry from. Thankfully, the game is incredible enough that most fans were just happy to let it go. Because let's be honest, Samus is a badass. And that is a rundown of just a handful of stupidly obvious video game plot holes that we all kinda put to the back of our minds so that we could get on with the good stuff. Let me know your favorites down in the comments below, and please check out the WhatCulture Gaming Podcast. For now, I've been Scott from WhatCulture.com, and I'll catch you soon.